This is the story of a husband blindsided by betrayal, but instead of breaking, he prepares for a powerful comeback. When his wife demands an open relationship, he quietly gathers evidence of her deceit, determined to turn the tables. Will his plan succeed, or will her lies unravel their life before he can strike back? Dive into this suspenseful story of betrayal, secrets, and ultimate redemption. Welcome to RedHead Cheating, your premier YouTube channel dedicated to unveiling jaw-dropping and unbelievable tales of infidelity. We are your go-to source for the most shocking and scandalous cheating stories that will leave you both horrified and intrigued. Join us as we delve into the secrets, lies, and betrayals that have rocked relationships and shattered trust. Our channel is committed to sharing these cautionary and eye-opening narratives, not to glorify cheating, but to shed light on the devastating consequences it can have on individuals and families. Cheating is a painful way to end a relationship and often leaves the other partner in a dark place. By presenting these stories, we hope to alleviate the pain you're experiencing by helping you realize that you're not alone. We are a media company focused on delivering the highest quality stories. Sometimes based on true events, our narratives always conclude with a valuable lesson, adding educational value to each video. Brandon McAllister sat in his dimly lit home office, the soft glow of the computer screen casting shadows across his face. It was another late night, one of many he'd been putting in to keep up with the relentless demands of his job as a software developer. He glanced at the clock, noting it was nearing 9:30 p.m., when a gentle knock on the door snapped him out of his focused state. "Come in," he called, saving his work and turning to see his wife, Jessica, standing in the doorway. Her athletic frame was backlit by the hallway light, but her usual lively energy was replaced by an unsettling calmness. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. There was a strange edge to her tone, one that sent a chill down Brandon's spine. "Sure," he replied, motioning her in. She moved across the room and perched on the edge of the leather sofa, hands clasped tightly in her lap, as though bracing herself. Brandon studied her, sensing this wasn't a casual conversation. "What's up?" Jessica took a deep breath, finally meeting his gaze. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about our marriage," she began, her words deliberate. "I feel like I need more freedom." Brandon's stomach clenched at the word. Freedom. They'd been married for 12 years, had 2 children, and worked hard to build a life together. This wasn't a term he'd ever associated with their marriage. "Freedom," he echoed, keeping his tone neutral. "What exactly do you mean?" Jessica hesitated, her expression shifting from apprehension to defiance. "I want to explore things with other men. I feel like our marriage has become too routine, too stagnant. I need to feel alive again." For a moment, Brandon just stared at her, struggling to process what he was hearing. Explore things with other men. He couldn't believe the words were coming from Jessica, the woman he'd built his life with, the mother of his children. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice barely concealing his shock. "You're saying you want to sleep with other men?" Jessica nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just about sex, Brandon. It's about rediscovery, growth. I feel like I've lost myself." Anger flared in Brandon's chest, replacing the initial shock. "Stagnant? Because I've been working long hours to support our family," he shot back, pacing the room to keep his composure. He could feel his grip on the life they'd built slipping, and his mind raced as he tried to understand her intentions. Jessica looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. "It's not about you. It's about me needing more. I think this could actually help us." Brandon laughed bitterly. "Help us? You think sleeping with other men is going to save our marriage?" Her face hardened, her eyes flashing with irritation. "You're twisting my words. I'm being honest with you, trying to give us a chance by addressing how I feel. Why can't you understand?" Brandon stopped pacing, facing her with a look of disbelief. "What about my feelings, Jessica? What about our kids? Do they just become collateral in your self-discovery journey? Jessica's jaw tightened, and for the first time, he saw something other than remorse, defiance. The kids don't have to know. We can keep things civil, maintain appearances. He cut her off, his voice rising with frustration. Maintain appearances? Is that all our marriage is to you now? She rose to her feet, her calm facade cracking. Brandon, you've been distant for years. When was the last time we truly connected? I need more than this arrangement. Brandon's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay composed. So, after 12 years and 2 kids, you're telling me that you're bored and need other men to feel alive? And I'm just supposed to accept it? Jessica's eyes welled with tears, her frustration boiling over. It's not about rejecting you. It's about finding myself. Brandon shook his head, letting the weight of her words sink in. No, Jessica. This is about you being selfish. You want it all, your family, your lifestyle, and your freedom. But you can't have it all. She opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand. Get out of my office. I can't look at you right now. Jessica seemed to hesitate, her mouth opening as if to argue. But seeing the anger in his eyes, she turned and left, closing the door softly behind her. In that single conversation, Brandon felt the foundation of his life shatter. As he sat back in his chair, the shock slowly faded, replaced by a new emotion, determination. Jessica thought she could throw this at him, tear their family apart on a whim, and still control the outcome. But she was wrong. Brandon wasn't going to crumble under her plans, he was going to prepare, carefully and methodically, to confront the betrayal with every resource he had. He opened a new document on his computer, meticulously recording every word of their conversation. Dates, times, exact phrases, all of it would become a record of her intentions. He would document everything, gather his evidence, and when the time came, ensure she faced the consequences. For now, he would stay quiet, observing her actions, letting her believe she was in control. But soon, she would realize just how mistaken she was. The days following that night were surreal. Brandon felt like he was living in a stranger's life, going through the motions of his daily routine with Jessica's shocking words echoing in his mind. Every interaction with her was now tinged with an undercurrent of tension. Jessica, however, seemed unfazed, almost relieved, as if a weight had been lifted. She went about her life with a new energy, which only fueled Brandon's determination to see her plans through a different lens. He chose to keep his suspicions and his anger under wraps, knowing that any confrontation now would play right into her hands. Brandon had read enough to understand that in cases like this, staying calm, observing, and documenting was the best approach. Jessica wanted control, wanted to push him into submission or, even worse, a reaction that could paint him as the unstable one. He wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. Each day, he watched her behavior shift. She began going out more frequently, and when he'd ask her where she was headed, her answers were vague, just meeting a friend or heading to the gym. She stayed out late, often coming home well past midnight, bringing with her a cloud of unfamiliar perfume and excuses that grew more creative by the day. Rather than pressing her, Brandon simply made mental notes, storing each detail in the private file he'd started after their initial conversation. He observed her texting constantly, often glancing up to make sure he wasn't watching. At first, she'd excuse herself to another room, but as her confidence grew, she became bolder, checking her messages right in front of him, her laughter quiet and secretive. He noticed she'd put a passcode on her phone, something she'd never felt the need to do before. Brandon knew he needed more than just mental notes. His lawyer, Sarah Crane, had emphasized the importance of keeping a documented timeline and gathering concrete evidence. So he created a spreadsheet, logging every suspicious outing, every strange behavior, and each dismissive comment she made. He noted the exact times she left the house, her reasons, and when she returned, including any telltale signs he picked up on, like the smell of a different cologne on her clothes or her slightly tipsy demeanor. One evening, as Jessica prepared to go out, she hesitated in front of the mirror, adjusting her outfit, a sleek dress he hadn't seen before, paired with heels she usually reserved for special occasions. Brandon couldn't resist the urge to test her boundaries. "Got a date?" he asked casually, giving her a half-smile. Jessica froze for a moment, then forced a laugh, brushing off his question with a dismissive wave. "Please, Brandon. It's just a girls' night. You don't need to worry." He nodded, maintaining his neutral expression. "Have fun, then," he said, keeping his tone light, as if he wasn't the least bit concerned. The truth was, the more brazen she became, the clearer her intentions became to him. And with each casual dismissal, each poorly disguised lie, his resolve only grew stronger. He had once promised himself he would do whatever it took to protect his family, but now he saw that protecting them meant being prepared to let go of the very person who was tearing it apart. As Jessica left, Brandon pulled out a small voice recorder, placing it in his pocket. He had invested in several discreet recording devices, per Sarah's advice, and had hidden one in the living room, another in the kitchen, and one in his office. He knew that gathering evidence wasn't just about catching her in the act, it was about creating a timeline, a story that would show the court her true intentions if it came to that. Once she was gone, he sat down at his computer and began typing, documenting everything from her reaction to his date comment to her choice of clothing and perfume. Every detail mattered, and as he typed, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. This was his preparation, his insurance, and he was taking back control in a way Jessica would never see coming. Brandon knew that playing the waiting game was the hardest part. He was watching the life he'd built crumble in slow motion, forced to stay silent as his wife drifted further from him with every lie, every new secret. But the more he observed, the more determined he became to see his plan through to the end. Jessica thought she was untouchable, that he would sit idly by while she pursued her freedom. But Brandon was building his own case, preparing for the day he'd confront her with the truth. And when that day came, she'd learn just how far he was willing to go to protect what was left of his life. A week after Jessica's freedom announcement, Brandon decided it was time to uncover the full extent of her deception. The signs were there, her secretive texting, late-night outings, and careless disregard for the life they'd once shared. But Brandon knew he needed hard evidence, something undeniable. And so, one night, when Jessica left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered, he seized the opportunity. He glanced toward the hallway, listening for the sound of running water, then picked up her phone. There it was, locked with a passcode she'd started using only recently. Remembering Jessica's tendency to use their children's birthdays or simple number sequences, he tried a few combinations, his heart pounding. On the third try, his son's birth date, the screen unlocked. The first thing he checked was her text messages. Her inbox was cluttered with messages from friends, family, and one particular contact marked only with a heart emoji. He opened the conversation, bracing himself. The texts were flirtatious, filled with inside jokes and late-night, thinking of you, messages. As he scrolled, he noticed the tone shift to something more suggestive. The man, whose name was Alex, was apparently someone she'd met a few months back. She'd sent him photos of herself, selfies taken when Brandon was at work, with captions like, "Just thinking of you." Alex responded with similar photos, none explicit but all intimate enough to make Brandon's chest tighten with anger. One exchange stood out, "I can't wait to see you again this weekend." Same place. Jessica had replied with a simple, "Yes. I'll tell him I'm going to a girls' night again." Brandon felt a knot tighten in his stomach. So her girls' nights were actually dates with this man. He took a screenshot of the entire conversation, forwarding it to his own phone, making sure he had a record of every line, every excuse. Evidence was what he needed, and this was just the beginning. Next, he opened her email app. Jessica wasn't one to delete messages, so he was able to find email confirmations for hotel reservations in a neighboring town, booked under her name. The dates coincided perfectly with her girls' nights. He saved those emails as well, forwarding them to himself for safekeeping. As he scrolled further, he found more incriminating emails, including one where she expressed excitement about an upcoming weekend away with Alex, thanking him for making her feel alive. Just as he was about to lock her phone, he noticed an unfamiliar app tucked away in a folder titled Utilities. It was a secure messaging app, one he hadn't seen before. Opening it, he found that Jessica had been using this app to communicate with not just Alex, but another contact named D. Their conversations were cryptic but suggestive, filled with messages that hinted at yet another affair. Brandon's heart sank as he read through her exchanges with this new man, seeing the same pattern of lies and secrecy. When he finally put her phone down, he felt both physically ill and strangely calm. There was no doubt now. Jessica wasn't just experimenting, she was leading a double life, one filled with deceit, betrayal, and calculated lies. But for all her cunning, she had been careless, leaving enough traces behind for Brandon to piece together the true extent of her infidelity. After locking her phone and setting it back on the counter, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his discovery settle over him. Jessica was in the shower, oblivious to the fact that Brandon now knew everything. She believed she was untouchable, that he would remain in the dark or simply tolerate her actions. But Brandon had gathered every detail he needed. She might think she was in control, but soon she'd realize just how carefully he'd been watching. He returned to his office, where he stored the new evidence in the secure file he'd created on his computer. Each screenshot, each email, each message became another layer in his growing case. Jessica's games were only pushing him closer to the day he'd confront her, armed with proof she couldn't deny. As the sound of the shower stopped and Jessica's footsteps approached, Brandon steeled himself. The time to act wasn't yet, but he was closer than ever. She had lit the fuse, and Brandon would be there when her house of lies finally burned down. With each piece of evidence he'd gathered, Brandon's next move became clear. He needed legal guidance to ensure he wasn't leaving anything to chance. He reached out to Sarah Crane, a high-powered divorce attorney known for her meticulous approach and her skill in high-stakes cases. She was known for her ability to turn even the smallest piece of evidence into a powerful advantage, and that was exactly what Brandon needed. When he arrived at her office, Sarah greeted him with a firm handshake and a confident smile, instantly putting him at ease. Her office was sleek and modern, its glass walls overlooking the bustling city below, and she motioned for him to sit across from her. She listened intently as he described Jessica's recent behavior, detailing the open relationship request, her mysterious outings, and the incriminating evidence he had gathered on her phone and email. After he finished, Sarah leaned back, studying him thoughtfully. "Brandon, it sounds like you have a strong case. Emotional manipulation, deception, infidelity, it's all there. But we need to be careful and strategic about how we proceed. This isn't just about proving her betrayal, it's about protecting your interests, especially your finances and custody rights if it comes to that." Brandon nodded, absorbing her words. "What do you suggest?" Sarah tapped her pen on her notepad, her expression focused. "First, continue gathering evidence, but be discreet. Don't let her suspect anything. The more we have, the stronger our position will be in court if we need to go there. Your documentation of her behavior, combined with the emails, text messages, and hotel reservations, are exactly what we need." She paused, leaning forward. "We also need to safeguard your finances. Has she expressed any interest in accessing your accounts or changing anything financially?" Brandon shook his head. "Not directly, but she's been spending more on herself lately, buying new clothes, going out to expensive places. I've been covering most of the household bills and expenses." Sarah nodded, making a quick note. "I suggest we protect your assets preemptively. Open a separate bank account in your name only, and start redirecting a portion of your income there. Keep track of your shared accounts, and limit her access to any new funds. This isn't to be vindictive, It's to prevent her from draining your resources if things get confrontational. Brandon listened, feeling a sense of relief. Sarah's guidance gave him a clear path forward, a way to protect himself without falling into the traps Jessica had tried to set. "What about the house?" he asked. "We bought it together, but I've paid the majority of the mortgage. We'll position you as the primary financial contributor, which works in your favor," Sarah replied. "Since you've shouldered most of the financial burden, that gives us leverage. If we file for a divorce, we can request that the house remain with you, especially if Jessica's behavior is proven to be destabilizing." Sarah then shifted gears, her gaze steady. "If there's any chance Jessica will try to use custody as leverage, we'll need a plan for that as well. Courts tend to prioritize stability, and if we can show that you're the steady, reliable parent, her chaotic behavior could work against her." Brandon's mind raced at the thought of his children caught in this mess, but Sarah's words reassured him. "I'd do anything to protect them," he said quietly. Sarah gave him an understanding nod. "Then here's what I recommend. Keep a detailed log of everything related to your children, the time you spend with them, any school activities, doctor appointments, all of it. Show that you're present and involved. If Jessica continues down this path, it will reflect poorly on her." As their meeting concluded, Brandon felt a renewed sense of purpose. Sarah handed him a folder with the initial paperwork, a solid plan for financial and legal protection. "Remember," she said, "don't confront her yet. Let her believe she's in control. The quieter you stay, the more careless she'll become." Brandon shook her hand, a silent gratitude passing between them. Jessica thought she had the upper hand, that her lies and manipulations would go unchallenged. But now, armed with Sarah's guidance and his growing mountain of evidence, Brandon knew that when the time came, he would be prepared to stand his ground. As he left Sarah's office, he felt the weight of the situation, but also the confidence that he was no longer navigating it alone. Jessica's betrayals wouldn't destroy him, they would be her undoing. With his plan mapped out, Brandon returned home that evening feeling both resolved and oddly calm. He was playing a waiting game, one that required patience and absolute control over his emotions. Sarah's advice echoed in his mind, "Don't confront her. Let her think she's winning. The more confident she feels, the more mistakes she'll make." From that point forward, Brandon adopted the role of the supportive husband, never giving Jessica a reason to suspect his true intentions. When she came home late or made excuses for her outings, he smiled and nodded, giving nothing away. It was difficult, every fiber of his being wanted to confront her, to demand answers, to throw her lies back in her face. But he knew that any sign of suspicion might make her tighten up and cover her tracks. Jessica, meanwhile, took his acceptance as permission to become even bolder. She started dressing differently, favoring expensive dresses and high heels, her appearance a stark contrast to the woman he'd married years before. She seemed almost giddy with her newfound freedom, smiling at her phone constantly, sharing inside jokes with people he'd never heard of, often while sitting right across from him. Brandon watched it all with a carefully constructed mask of indifference, acting as though her behavior was normal. One evening, when she came downstairs in an outfit far too dressy for a supposed night out with friends, he made a point to compliment her, noting how beautiful she looked. Jessica seemed momentarily surprised, then gave him a pleased smile, as if she believed she still held all the cards. "You're in a good mood tonight," he remarked, keeping his tone light. "Oh, just feeling liberated," she replied, a hint of smugness in her voice. "It's nice to feel like myself again." Brandon simply nodded, watching her reaction carefully. She had no idea that his words were just part of the act, that he was studying her every move, letting her confidence inflate to dangerous levels. He even went as far as to encourage her plans, casually asking, "So, when's the next night out with the girls? You should take some time for yourself." Each time he said it, he could see her deflective smile, her guarded way of keeping him at arm's length, only made her feel more justified. In her mind, he was the oblivious, passive husband she could easily deceive. Little did she know, every night she was away, every mysterious trip she took, was being catalogued. Brandon's double life didn't stop with the subtle manipulation. Following Sarah's advice, he began to protect his finances without alerting Jessica. He opened a private account, transferring small amounts of money each month, enough to build a safety net in case Jessica decided to make any sudden financial moves. He also redirected his paycheck to a new account, leaving just enough in the joint account to cover household expenses and ensure she wouldn't notice. It wasn't just financial precautions he was taking. Brandon continued logging every interaction with Jessica, tracking her increasingly reckless behavior. He noted her whereabouts, her new friends, and each unexplained late night. All of it became evidence, compiled in a secure folder he'd labeled Household Projects, safely hidden among work files on his computer. There were days when Brandon's patience nearly broke, times when Jessica's arrogance was almost too much to bear. Once, while they were having dinner, Jessica slipped up, mentioning a business meeting she had at a hotel, a detail that didn't match any previous explanations she'd given. She quickly covered her mistake, brushing it off as if it were nothing, but Brandon caught the flicker of realization in her eyes. She was playing a risky game and knew it, but her belief in his ignorance allowed her to push further. As she left that night for yet another meetup, Brandon watched her go, knowing that every move she made brought her closer to a confrontation she wouldn't be prepared for. The evidence was mounting, and her confidence would be her downfall. In the meantime, Brandon kept playing the part, his demeanor unchanging, his patience unbreakable. Jessica might think she was in control, but little did she know, her entire game was being orchestrated by the man she believed she'd left in the dark. Jessica's confidence was building, her self-assuredness reaching new heights as she seemed to believe her lies were holding up and that Brandon had either accepted her new lifestyle or was too oblivious to question it. As the weeks passed, her casual mentions of nights with friends and business meetings grew bolder. But it wasn't until she introduced a new figure into her life, a man named Tony, that Brandon felt the true extent of her arrogance. One evening, as Brandon returned home from work, he found Jessica seated in the living room, sipping wine with a man he'd never seen before. Tony was tall and casually dressed, with an air of cockiness that was impossible to miss. Brandon hid his surprise, though his pulse quickened as he shook hands with the man, who introduced himself with a confident grin. "This is Tony, a friend from the gym," Jessica explained smoothly, her tone casual, almost dismissive. "He's been helping me get back in shape. I thought it would be nice to invite him over for a drink." Brandon nodded, playing his role to perfection. "Nice to meet you, Tony," he said warmly, masking the churn of emotions that lay just beneath the surface. It was clear that Jessica had no respect for their marriage or for the trust they'd once shared. Bringing this man into their home, under the guise of friendship, was a line he hadn't expected her to cross so blatantly. For the rest of the evening, Brandon played the part of the polite host, pouring drinks and engaging in small talk as if nothing were out of the ordinary. He watched Jessica flirt openly, her laughter a bit too loud, her glances at Tony too lingering. Tony, for his part, seemed oblivious to the tension, leaning into Jessica's attention with smug self-assurance. At one point, Jessica excused herself to the kitchen, leaving Brandon and Tony alone. Brandon seized the moment, taking a sip of his drink as he studied Tony carefully. "So, you've known Jessica for a while?" he asked casually, keeping his tone light. Tony shrugged, his smile a touch too relaxed. "A few months. She mentioned things were complicated between you two. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Brandon replied, matching Tony's smile with one of his own. "I'm glad Jessica has someone she feels comfortable with." He watched Tony's reaction carefully, noting the man's slightly cocky expression. It was clear that Tony believed he was part of some hidden relationship, one that existed outside of Jessica's marriage. Brandon felt a surge of anger, but he kept it contained, reminding himself that every interaction, every bit of evidence, was bringing him closer to his end goal. Jessica returned, carrying a tray of snacks, and settled back next to Tony on the couch. Brandon continued his role, observing as she leaned toward Tony, laughing and touching his arm. Inwardly, he marveled at her audacity, wondering if she thought he was blind to the display she was putting on right in front of him. As the evening wore on, Jessica's confidence only grew. She didn't hesitate to mention upcoming plans, telling Brandon she'd be out late on Friday for a workout session with Tony, followed by dinner with some friends. Brandon gave a small nod, storing the information away, knowing it would add to his meticulously kept log. Finally, Tony stood to leave, giving Jessica a quick hug as he said goodbye. "Nice meeting you, Brandon," he said, his tone casual, oblivious to the scrutiny he'd been under all evening. "Likewise, Tony," Brandon replied, shaking his hand with a firm grip, letting the man leave without any hint of the turmoil brewing just beneath the surface. After Tony left, Jessica turned to Brandon, her expression relaxed, almost smug. "Thanks for being cool with him coming over," she said, her tone oddly dismissive. "I know this might be unconventional, but I appreciate your understanding." Brandon forced a tight smile. "Of course. If it makes you happy, that's what matters." Jessica's smile widened, her eyes flashing with satisfaction. In her mind, she had succeeded in breaking free from the constraints of their marriage, and Brandon's acceptance only emboldened her further. She had no idea that each reckless move, each careless lie, was drawing her deeper into a trap of her own making. Later that night, Brandon added every detail of the evening to his growing record. He documented Tony's visit, Jessica's flirtations, her fabricated workout session plans, all of it added to the secure folder on his computer. He realized that Jessica's blatant disregard for their marriage was no longer just a betrayal, it was a challenge, a test of his resolve. But she didn't know that Brandon was prepared. He would continue to play along, letting her believe she held all the power. And when the time came, every reckless decision, every friend she brought into their lives, would be used to ensure her downfall. As Brandon continued playing the part of the supportive husband, maintaining his quiet resolve, the emotional strain began to weigh on him. Watching Jessica so blatantly flaunt her new life left him feeling betrayed and disoriented. Some nights, when he was alone, the anger and sadness felt almost unbearable, but he reminded himself that he needed to stay focused on the bigger picture. He'd invested years into his marriage, built a home, a life for their children, and he wasn't going to let her reckless decisions destroy all of it. One evening, when the weight of it all felt particularly overwhelming, Brandon decided to confide in someone. He called his old friend and trusted co-worker, Mike, who had always been a calm, reliable presence in his life. The two met up at a local diner after work, away from prying eyes, where Brandon could speak freely without the risk of Jessica overhearing. As they settled into a booth, Brandon looked around, then took a deep breath, letting out a sigh he hadn't even realized he was holding. Mike, sensing his friend's distress, leaned forward, his expression concerned. "All right, man, what's going on? You look like you've been through a war." Brandon hesitated, gathering his thoughts, before he began explaining everything. He told Mike about Jessica's sudden desire for freedom, her suspicious outings, her lies, and her new friend Tony. He described the mounting evidence he'd been quietly collecting and the advice he'd received from his lawyer, Sarah. Mike listened intently, his brow furrowing as the story unfolded. When Brandon finished, there was a heavy silence between them. "Wow," Mike finally said, shaking his head. "I knew something was off with her, but I didn't think it was this bad." "I'm sorry, Brandon. I can't imagine how hard this must be." Brandon nodded, his expression grim. "It's been rough, to say the least. But at this point, I have to think about protecting myself and the kids. I can't let her tear everything apart because she wants to play out some fantasy." Mike reached across the table, giving Brandon's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You're doing the right thing, gathering evidence and being smart about it. I know it's hard, but stay strong. She'll slip up sooner or later, and when she does, you'll be ready." The support was a relief for Brandon. Talking with someone who understood his position, who didn't judge him or make light of the situation, made him feel less isolated. Mike reminded him that he wasn't alone in this, that he had allies and resources he could rely on. They talked late into the evening, with Mike offering to help wherever he could, whether it was gathering evidence or being a sounding board when Brandon needed it. By the time he left the diner, Brandon felt lighter, his determination renewed. He knew the battle wasn't over, but having a friend who had his back made it easier to face what lay ahead. Returning home that night, Brandon felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in weeks. Jessica's games had pushed him to his limits, but they hadn't broken him. He was prepared to face whatever came next, bolstered by the knowledge that he had support, a plan, and the resolve to see it through. He entered the house quietly, Jessica already asleep in their bedroom. As he stood in the doorway, watching her sleep, he felt a surge of emotion. There had once been love and trust between them, but now all he felt was a steely resolve. Jessica thought she was outsmarting him, that her lies were holding, but she couldn't have been more wrong. Brandon turned and went to his office, logging into his computer to update the file with new details from the week. Every word, every action, was carefully documented, another building block in the case he was methodically constructing. With Mike's support, his lawyer's guidance, and his own determination, Brandon knew he was ready for whatever Jessica threw at him next. He would not let her destroy the life they'd built, and he was ready to show her just how much strength he'd found within himself. It was a Friday evening when Jessica finally revealed her ultimate plan. Brandon had been expecting something like this for weeks. She'd grown increasingly bold, certain that he was oblivious to her double life. Tonight, she seemed even more confident, a smirk playing on her lips as she sat across from him at the dinner table, her glass of wine in hand. "Brandon," she began, her tone casual but laced with an underlying tension. "We need to talk." He set down his fork, giving her his full attention. "Sure," he replied calmly, masking any hint of the anticipation building within him. Jessica took a breath, as though preparing for a grand announcement. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about us, our marriage. And I feel like, things need to change if I'm going to be happy." Brandon kept his face neutral. "What do you mean by change?" She hesitated for only a moment, her confidence solidifying as she met his gaze. "I want us to open our relationship," she said, her tone firm. "It's obvious we've drifted apart. I need the freedom to explore what I want without feeling restricted." Brandon paused, as though considering her words, before nodding slowly. "So, you're saying you want to see other people?" Jessica's eyes lit up, mistaking his calm as compliance. "Yes. It's what I need. I think you'll find it liberating too. You could meet new people, live a little more." "Interesting," he replied, his voice steady. "And you think this will fix our marriage?" She shrugged, swirling her wine. "Honestly, I think it's the only thing that will keep us together. I love what we've built, but I can't be tied down. Not like this." Brandon leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You know, Jessica, I've suspected this was coming for a while. But I'll be honest, I'm disappointed you didn't just come clean. Instead, you've been sneaking around, lying, and disrespecting everything we built together." Jessica's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. I didn't think you'd understand." "Understand?" he echoed, his tone shifting as he slowly slid a manila folder across the table toward her. "Oh, I understand more than you think." She stared at the folder, her hand hovering over it uncertainly. "What's this?" "Open it," Brandon replied, folding his hands in his lap. With a wary glance, Jessica opened the folder, her face paling as she scanned its contents. The first few pages contained printouts of her text exchanges with Alex, her friend. Following those were screenshots of hotel reservation confirmations, her nights away that she had labeled girls' nights. Further down, she found photos from her messaging apps, including her exchanges with Tony. Jessica's fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages, her breathing growing shallow. How did you get these?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Brandon didn't blink. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that I've known about your affairs for a long time. I've documented everything, the nights you snuck out, the lies, even the messages with your friends that you thought I didn't know about." Jessica's face contorted with shock and anger. "You've been spying on me," she hissed. "Spying? No," he said calmly. "I've been protecting myself. You chose to break our trust, to deceive me at every turn. I simply decided not to be blind to it." Jessica pushed the folder away, as though it burned her fingers. "So, what now?" she demanded, trying to regain her composure. "Are you going to divorce me?" Brandon's eyes narrowed. "Yes. I am. My attorney has already prepared the papers. This marriage, the one you've tried to turn into a joke, is over. You're free to explore all you want now, Jessica, but you'll be doing it alone." For the first time, he saw genuine fear in her eyes. She'd believed he would be passive, that he would accept her demands without question. Now, confronted with the reality of losing everything, her bravado was gone. You can't be serious," she stammered, her voice breaking. "I was just trying to make things exciting again. I didn't mean." "No, Jessica," he interrupted, his tone unyielding. "You meant every word. You wanted freedom, and now you have it. But you won't be taking my dignity, my self-respect, or any part of my life with you." Jessica opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. She stared at him, realizing just how drastically she had misjudged him. The husband she had tried to manipulate, to mold into a shadow of himself, was no longer the man sitting across from her. Brandon stood, picking up the folder and placing it back into his briefcase. "My lawyer will be in touch. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but don't expect to find it here." Leaving Jessica speechless in her own web of deceit, Brandon walked out of the room, feeling a surge of strength and closure. Jessica thought she had controlled the narrative, but now she was the one left with nothing, her so-called freedom turning into the very thing that unraveled her life. In the days that followed, Jessica's attempts to regain control only led her deeper into trouble. She called Brandon relentlessly, trying to backtrack, to spin her actions as a misguided attempt to revitalize their marriage. But Brandon ignored her pleas, refusing to give her any hope of reconciliation. He'd seen through her too many times, and now, with the evidence in his hands, he was determined to ensure she faced the consequences of her betrayal. The divorce proceedings began swiftly, with Brandon's attorney, Sarah Crane, leading the charge. Sarah wasted no time, presenting the extensive evidence Brandon had gathered, texts, hotel receipts, photos, and records of her financial indiscretions. With each piece of evidence, Sarah methodically built a case showing Jessica's infidelity, her irresponsible behavior, and her blatant disregard for their marriage. Jessica's lawyer, a man clearly unused to handling cases so heavily stacked against his client, attempted to mitigate the damage. He argued that Jessica's behavior was a cry for help and tried to paint her actions as an attempt to find fulfillment in a distant marriage. But the hard evidence Sarah presented left little room for sympathy. One by one, Sarah countered every defense with cold, hard facts. Your client's desire for fulfillment came at the expense of her husband's trust and dignity, Sarah stated firmly, her voice cutting through the courtroom. Mr. McAllister gave Jessica everything, a family, stability, and support, only to be betrayed and misled. Her actions were not a cry for help, they were a calculated series of deceptions, and the evidence makes that perfectly clear. Brandon watched Jessica's expression shift with each passing day in court, the confidence she had once worn like armor now crumbling with every new revelation. Her bravado was gone, replaced by a desperate, hollow look as she realized how thoroughly her life was unraveling. The final blow came when Sarah submitted a request for Brandon to retain primary ownership of their home, as well as a substantial portion of Jessica's business assets. Since Brandon had contributed significantly to their shared finances while Jessica had spent frivolously on herself and her new lifestyle, Sarah argued that it was only fair that Brandon be compensated for his role in their shared financial stability. Jessica's lawyer tried to counter, claiming that she needed her business to sustain herself post-divorce. But Sarah presented bank statements showing that Jessica had used the business funds irresponsibly, often on personal expenses unrelated to work, thereby jeopardizing its stability. The judge, clearly unimpressed with Jessica's behavior and persuaded by the weight of evidence, ruled in Brandon's favor on nearly all counts. The marital home was awarded to Brandon, along with a portion of Jessica's business assets to compensate for her financial betrayal. Jessica would be left with far less than she'd expected, her lavish lifestyle now reduced to mere remnants. When the final verdict was read, Jessica's face was pale, her eyes hollow as she glanced over at Brandon. He met her gaze with a steady, resolute expression, feeling a sense of finality wash over him. The woman who had once tried to turn him into a submissive, powerless version of himself was now the one left with nothing. Her plans, her arrogance, her schemes, they had all backfired, leaving her with only the consequences she had so eagerly dismissed. As they exited the courtroom, Jessica approached him one last time. "Brandon, please," she whispered, desperation lacing her voice. "Can't we try to work something out? I made a mistake, but we have so much history." Brandon looked at her, his face unreadable. "Our history ended the moment you decided to tear it apart, Jessica. You wanted freedom, and now you have it. You'll just be living it alone." Without another word, he turned and walked away, feeling an immense weight lift as he left the courthouse. The long battle was over, and Brandon knew that he'd won back not just his life, but his self-respect. Months after the final court ruling, Brandon found himself standing in the quiet of his home, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Jessica was gone, their divorce settled, and the remnants of her chaotic presence had been removed, replaced by a newfound calm that filled every corner of his life. Since the court proceedings, Jessica had faded from his thoughts more than he'd expected. She'd tried reaching out a few times, desperate and apologetic, hoping to rekindle even a sliver of the life they once had. Each message, each tearful voicemail, went unanswered. Brandon knew that reconnecting would only drag him back into the pain he'd fought so hard to leave behind. His children had adapted remarkably well to the new normal, his quiet strength and steady presence giving them the stability they needed. He had thrown himself into rebuilding their lives, refocusing on work and rediscovering the joy of simple things, spending evenings together, helping with school projects, or just laughing over family meals. The laughter had returned to their home, and it was genuine now, no longer dampened by suspicion and unease. One evening, as Brandon sat on the back porch watching the sunset, he reflected on the path that had led him here. He remembered the shock of Jessica's initial announcement, the weeks spent gathering evidence, the patience he'd shown as she flaunted her betrayal. It had been a journey filled with anger, pain, and sleepless nights, but he'd come out the other side with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. There was a newfound lightness in his heart now, a quiet pride in knowing he had taken back control of his life. He hadn't allowed Jessica's lies to define him, instead, he had reclaimed his own story, rewriting it with resilience and self-respect. In doing so, he had set an example for his children, showing them that dignity and integrity mattered, that they were values worth protecting, even when it meant walking away from someone they loved. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Brandon felt ready to close this chapter for good. He didn't harbor anger or resentment anymore, he'd left those feelings behind in the courtroom, along with Jessica's hollow promises. Now, he looked to the future, a blank canvas on which he could paint a new life, a life defined by honesty, peace, and a profound respect for himself. With a deep breath, he rose from his chair, feeling the warm evening air wrap around him. He wasn't the man he had been when this all began. He was stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. Brandon turned and went inside, closing the door on the past, embracing the promise of a brighter, unburdened future.